can human beings reorient themselves in complex situations of crisis or conflict when their familiar world, relational home, and previous system of coordinates is out of joint? This is the question to which Werner Stegmaier has provided a strong and solid answer by investigating the history of the concept of orientation and the structures of human orientation processes. Responding to the problem of the ever-increasing complexity of our world, the philosophy of orientation describes ways of navigating through our bewildering world. For instance, the strategy of interpreting signs, identifying signposts and footholds, structuring life in routines, and reflecting on possibilities. Thus, orientation is basically a move from confusion to clarity. In what follows, I will elaborate 3 aspects of this move: managing uncertainties, handling paradoxes, and creating courageous beginnings of new orientations. As we just heard in Werner's speech, orientation works by transforming uncertainties into certainties that are sufficient for acting successfully. But what kind of certainties are sufficient for acting successfully? And what are the criteria for success? When philosophy questions all claims to absolute certainty, and rightly does so, this may, in a Nietzschean trajectory, be understood as a stimulus for life. Yet, there is a negative flip side. We are always facing the risk that an apparent foothold may turn out to be a trap. Therefore, we have to find out which persons, which institutions or systems deserve our trust. In our imperfect world, we cannot avoid disappointments. Nevertheless, we can learn from the experience we gain and fine-tune our responses accordingly. We cannot know in advance who or what is trustworthy. We know it first when taking the risk of actually placing our trust on someone or something. Often it will take a long time before we can draw a definite conclusion, since the hints and clues we receive are ambiguous. They can be interpreted in different ways, and our interpretations are always already shaped by our trust or mistrust. Regarding the reliability in question, we might be taken by surprise in positive or negative ways. And this predicament reacts upon our basic certainties. In 1950-51, Ludwig Wittgenstein jotted down some notes that were posthumously published under the title On Certainty, über Gewissheit. Here he argues that the questions that we raise and our doubts depend on the fact that some propositions are exempt from doubt. Hence, our very core beliefs and fundamental certainties are not debatable. Wittgenstein refers to propositions claiming, for instance, that the world has existed for quite a long time, claims that cannot be proven to be true, but nonetheless stand fast for us. Such propositions function as the unfounded foundation of reasoning. Normally, certainties like these orient us about what to expect from the world and about how to understand what others say. And these bedrock certainties are not dependent upon prior thought. Rather, they operate in our thought and action. They require no justification, and as such, they ground our common sense. Now, imagine that our basic certainties become shaken. Severe collective trauma like war or terror attacks like 9/11 are examples of events that require the reorientation of a whole nation. How does that work if we cannot rely on absolute truths and values? Given that values are continuously revalued and truths are successively renewed, there is only one conclusion. And now I quote from the leaflet, Successful Modes of Orientation. We have to accept the uncertainties in the current world and use them creatively. However, the acceptance of uncertainties or their creative transformation does not imply that nothing is true or that there is ultimately nothing firm to rely on. The philosophy of orientation is not nihilistic. Rather, as Werner Stegmaier points out in his fearless findings, the philosophy of orientation is, I quote, the positive response to the dreaded nihilism. And this is the case because of its flexibility in handling so-called fluctuances, things, signs, and terms that shift their meaning over time. The philosophy of orientation traces these shifts of meaning without fear and examines in every new situation what it is we can rely on in the lack of an objective criterion for successful orientation. It refers to subjective feelings of reassuring calmness or unsettling concern. And this affective contrast precedes the cognitive distinction between truth and falsity. Yet, even though the uncertainty management is therefore not primarily, that is, not in the first instance, about truth and falsity, questions of truth play a role. If not as theoretical truth claims, then as practical matter of actions being tested. Will they hold good? And do they feel all right? And in this context, truth is something to be done, to be fulfilled by deeds through which we can be true to ourselves and faithful to others. Subjective self-confidence alone is not enough to assess whether one has acted successfully. One can be so sure-footed and nonetheless go astray. Since most of our actions are interactions with others, the question of success is no longer limited to individuals, but embraces human coexistence, not only locally, but globally. Worldwide, we are currently facing enormous challenges of orientation or reorientation, and there is a wide variety of factors over which we have no control. However, we nonetheless have to respond somehow. Our response to these challenges will have an indelible impact on what it means to be human in future times. Our change of mind and conduct, or our indifference, will determine the quality of life also of our children and grandchildren. And no matter how we respond, we are responsible for what we do. And coming generations will judge our failure or success. My second point, another essential modality of orientation is handling paradoxes. Paradoxes occur when contradictory alternatives exclude each other for logical reasons, and yet both alternatives are equally correct. Paradoxes may enable us to operate with both alternatives and explore new paths of thought. Then disorientation can be turned into a deeper and richer faceted form of reorientation. As Werner Stegmaier explains, paradoxes can make one's thinking oscillate and then block it. Yet following Niklas Luhmann, these oscillations and blockages of thinking caused by paradoxes can be regarded as new means for thinking. Let me illustrate this. One of the most startling examples that we all know from our everyday lives is human identity, which is paradoxical as a norm of orientation. The paradox being that identity presupposes and entails non-identity. For in order to be identical with oneself, one must also be distinguishable from oneself. We cannot understand or recognize ourselves directly, but only via detours in relation to others and in our reactions to how they see us. In other words, identity is not sameness. Rather, identity appears as self-transformation. Another example is the paradox of religious orientation. It concerns the thought of that which exceeds all thinking, the notion of God or unconditioned being, which affects the very conditions of orientation. To quote Werner Stegmaier, the Abrahamic religions, that is Judaism, Christianity, Islam, start from a clearly signified and all-governing paradox that everything is to be grasped via God, but He Himself is ungraspable. To resolve that paradox of grasping the ungraspable and comprehending the incomprehensible, signs proffer themselves. In signs, something ungraspable may show itself without being already comprehended. End of quote. God hides, as it were, in the signs of Scripture and invites acts of decoding. However, the mystery remains, since we cannot think the unthinkable. And therefore, religious orientation runs the risk of holding on to something holdless. Ultimately, faith is a matter of trust. And trustful faith does not leave behind uncertainty, but is a way of coping with existential uncertainty. The German philosopher Volker Gerhardt has tried to develop a rational theology by defining God as the horizon of meaning of the all, Sinnhorizont des Ganzen. Yet not even he can avoid paradoxical tensions, and this is due to the metaphors he uses. First of all, the metaphor of the horizon. Werner Stegmaier has provided a superb analysis of this metaphor, which deserves to be quoted at length. At the coast, the horizon seems to become visible as a demarcation line behind which nothing can be seen. However, this horizon at the same time turns out to be a paradoxical limit, as the limit of delimiting as such. When viewing something before a horizon, you can see and at the same time not see the horizon, for when looking at it, it is no longer the horizon. Instead, you see what you then see before another horizon. And thus, by being neither a visible nor an invisible limit of viewing or understanding, a horizon first of all allows one to view or understand something. End of quote. Like the horizon, God can appear to be near and far away at the same time, revealing Himself in concealing Himself. In respecting the mysteries, religion can keep awake human attention to that which gives meaning to our existence without us ever being able to understand it fully. And thereby, religious orientation secures us against a false sense of security. Handling paradoxes implies, ultimately, that we become ready to give up illusions regarding human power and to gain a realistic approach to human limits. Let me finally return to Werner Stegmaier's definition of orientation. He defines it as the achievement of finding one's way in a situation under uncertainty and time pressure in order to make out opportunities for action to master the situation. I would like to add that orientation at its best also clarifies the limit of what we can master, since we can only orient ourselves realistically if we are aware of our limits. There is always something that eludes us, that is not at our disposal, something we cannot make up for once it is lost. Health, for instance, or additional lifetime in the view of imminent death. Thus, each person has to decide, what do I wish to dedicate my life to? What is it that really counts and that remains even after we are gone? In placing the human vis-à-vis the divine, religion directs us to the very origin and ground of our being, and to a meaning much higher and wider than our own ideas of success or failure. Before God, man is not the measure. Rather, in relation to God, we may become aware of shortcomings, dependencies, and human frailty that induces intellectual humility rather than hubris. Are we really the architects of our own fortune, and can we forge our own destiny? To some extent, we may be able to do so, but we are also confronted with powers that by far exceed ours. And as Werner already mentioned, we are small before the huge sculpture of the Greek goddess of wisdom that we can see here in the Parthenon. Yet how much smaller are we before the creator of the universe? If we pursue such thoughts, we inevitably run into paradoxes. However, this is no reason to worry. Intellectually indissoluble contradictions keep us moving and searching, not least for the absolute beginner who has begun to create this world long before we even could start with our beginnings. Before we end up with paradoxical forms of reflection, we often have a pre-reflective sense of ambivalence, that is, a sense of positive or negative emotional balance at the same time. Ambivalence of this kind becomes productive rather than obstructive when both the argument for and the arguments against something are taken into account. Yet, we can only reach a conclusion when our thinking transcends binary logic. But how is this possible? The following Yiddish anecdote can give us a clue. A very wise and famous rabbi was asked to settle a long-standing dispute between two philosophers. And he listened intently as the first philosopher presented the case. And after reflecting carefully, he said, "You're right." After hearing the second philosopher and his brilliant and ingenious refutation, the rabbi said, "You're right." Somewhat confused by this performance, his wife complained, "You told both philosophers that they were right, but their arguments were totally contradictory. They can't both be right." And the rabbi replied, "You know something? You're also right." That which looks like a false syllogism is in fact a new beginning. Paradoxes which unite opposites can fill us with wonder and thereby initiate a fresh start of thinking. And for this reason, the strategy of handling paradoxes is most fruitful when the paradoxes are not dissolved, but each pole of them is respected as the keeper of a particula veri in Latin, a share of truth. In this way, we can operationalize complications without recoiling into oversimplifications. And it is not a coincidence that Werner Stegmaier that he has given the title Courageous Beginnings to his latest booklet about the philosophy of orientation. And this booklet describes marvelous situations of new orientations in the history of philosophy. Let me conclude with a warm thank you to the Hodges Foundation for Philosophical Orientation for providing Werner's books as presents to the audience and for supporting research on future adventures of reorientation.